The mud beneath Captain Sarai's boots had turned black 3 days ago. Not the natural black of waterlogged earth, but the black of something fundamental dying. Each step released the stench of copper and burnt hair, as if the very ground had been baptized in industrial blood. Above her, the sky hung like torn canvas, neither day nor night, but something diseased between them. She crouched at the lip of Trench Magdalene, watching the horizon through her field glasses. The sound reached her first. A grinding, methodical thunder that made her teeth ache and her bones vibrate in their sockets. Then came the sight that would haunt every surviving witness until their dying breath. Khazar, the ninth gate, rose from the wasteland like a cathedral of iron and spite. The Automaton stood, 300 feet tall, its body a fusion of mosque architecture and blasphemous engineering. Minarets jutted from its shoulders like broken fingers, each one crowned with a howling mouth that belched steam and screams in equal measure. Its head was a dome of tarnished gold, pierced by 1,000 windows that flickered with the light of trapped souls. But it was the legs that made Sarai's hands shake. Each leg was a foundry unto itself, a massive cylinder of black iron riddled with furnace ports and bleeding vents. Molten gold dripped from every joint and seam, pooling in the craters left by the giant's footsteps. The metal did not cool. It steamed and writhed like living tissue, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Sweet mother of sorrows," whispered Corporal Yusef, crossing himself with a hand missing 2 fingers. "What manner of devil walks among us?" Sarai lowered her glasses, her engineer's mind already cataloging the horror before them. She had served the Iron Sultanate for 12 years before her exile, had helped design the siege engines that cracked the walls of New Antioch. She recognized the relic engine signatures, the way the air itself seemed to bend around the automaton's power core, but this was beyond anything the Sultan's artificers had ever conceived. The walking vault moved with deliberate purpose across the blasted heath, each step a calculated destruction. Its passage left behind furrows of glass where the molten gold had superheated the earth. In its wake, nothing grew, nothing could grow. The very concept of life seemed to flee from those golden tears. "How many souls do you think it holds, Captain?" asked Private Miriam, her voice barely above a whisper. The young sapper's face had gone ashen, her usually steady hands trembling as she adjusted her pack of demolition charges. Sarai studied the automaton's torso through her glasses again. The dome head pulsed with an inner light that shifted through colors no healthy eye should witness. Behind each window, she could make out shapes, human shapes, pressed against the glass like drowning swimmers, desperate for air. "Thousands," she said, finally. "Maybe tens of thousands." The revelation hung between them like a funeral shroud. Sarai had heard the reports filtering down from the forward observers. Entire villages had vanished overnight, their populations simply gone without trace or struggle. The Iron Sultanate's conscription raids had grown increasingly bold, sweeping up not just able-bodied men, but women, children, the elderly, the infirm, anyone with a soul worth harvesting. "Captain," Yusef's voice carried a note of desperate hope. The briefing said there might be a way to free them, to shut down the engine and let the dead rest. Sarai nodded, though the motion felt like lifting a great weight. "The core chamber. If we can reach it, overload the binding circles, the soul should disperse naturally. But first, we have to get inside." She traced the automaton's outline with her finger, noting the service hatches and maintenance ports that dotted its legs like metallic pores. Her time with the Sultanate's engineering corps had taught her to read the language of relic engines, to understand the flow of spiritual energy through consecrated metal and blood-blessed gears. "The leg foundries," she said, more to herself than to her companions. "Every relic engine needs cooling systems, exhaust ports, maintenance access. Something that size can't be perfectly sealed." "And if the reports about the gold are true?" Miriam asked. Sarai had read those reports. Scout teams that had gotten too close to the Automaton's legs spoke of molten metal that moved with purpose, that reached for living flesh like grasping fingers. The gold was not mere byproduct, but part of the binding mechanism, a liquid network that carried the trapped soul's anguish throughout the giant's frame. "Then we move fast and pray the blessed silver in our ammunition provides some protection." The three of them settled into the trench to wait for full darkness. Around them, the remains of Trench Magdalene told their own story of horror. The wooden duckboards had warped into impossible angles, their grain twisted into patterns that resembled screaming faces. The sandbags leaked not sand, but a fine black powder that smelled of cremated prayers. Somewhere in the deeper tunnels, something that had once been human wept continuously in a language that predated human speech. As the diseased twilight deepened, Sarai found herself thinking of her daughter. Little Yasmin would be 9 years old now, assuming she still lived in the refugee camps outside Damascus. Sarai had not seen her in 3 years, not since her exile from the Sultanate's service. The memory of Yasmin's laugh felt like a foreign thing now, a sound from another world entirely. "Movement," Yusuf hissed, pointing toward the automaton. Khazar, the ninth gate, had stopped its grinding march across the wasteland. The massive legs locked into position with a sound like the world's largest coffin slamming shut. Steam vented from hidden ports along its frame, creating clouds that reeked of brimstone and boiled brass. Then came the sound that would haunt Sarai's dreams for the remainder of her short life. Singing. 10,000 voices raised in perfect, agonized harmony. A hymn of praise to powers that should never be named, carried on the wind like a plague. The words were in no earthly language, but their meaning burned itself into the listeners' minds with the clarity of heated iron. Glory to the ninth gate. Glory to the walking vault. Glory to the chains that bind the soul to service eternal. God preserve us, Miriam whimpered, pressing her hands to her ears. Blood trickled between her fingers. The singing continued for exactly 7 minutes, then cut off with surgical precision. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the steady drip of molten gold from the automaton's joints. Each drop hit the earth with a tiny hiss, like saliva on a hot stove. "Now," Sarai whispered, while it's stationary. They climbed from the trench and began their approach across the blasted ground. The earth beneath their feet grew increasingly warm as they neared the Automaton, until even through their boots they could feel the heat of whatever furnaces burned in its core. The air shimmered with thermals that carried the taste of copper and myrrh. Up close, the sheer scale of Khazar, the ninth gate, beggared description. Each leg was easily 60 feet in diameter, a cylindrical foundry that rose like a temple pillar into the shadows above. The surface was not smooth but textured with thousands of relief carvings. Verses from the Quran twisted into blasphemous new meanings. Arabic calligraphy that spelled out the true names of entities that should remain nameless. And everywhere, The faces of the damned, their mouths open in eternal screams of praise. Sarai found what she was looking for near the base of the left leg, a maintenance hatch, its edges sealed with lead and blessed silver. The lock was a masterwork of spiritual engineering, requiring not just the correct key but the proper prayers spoken in the correct order. Fortunately, she had helped design similar systems during her time with the Sultanate. "Keep watch," she whispered to her companions as she began the delicate work of bypassing the lock's defenses. The mechanism fought her every step of the way. Each tumbler that fell into place released a small puff of incense-scented smoke. The smell was pleasant at first, almost comforting, but it carried an undertone of something far more sinister. The smoke moved with purpose, coiling around her hands like tiny serpents, seeking entry through any available opening. "Captain," Yusuf's voice carried a note of barely controlled panic. "Something's happening to the gold." Sarai glanced up from her work to see rivulets of molten metal beginning to flow more rapidly from the leg's vents and seams. The gold moved like liquid mercury, gathering in pools that reflected not the sky above, but something else entirely. In their depths, shapes moved, human shapes, reaching upward with desperate hands. "Almost got it," she muttered, forcing her attention back to the lock. 2 more tumblers to go. The metal around the hatch began to grow warm under her fingers. Not the gentle warmth of sunlight, but the invasive heat of fever. The carved faces in the relief work seemed to be watching her now, their stone eyes tracking her movements with predatory interest. Finally, with a click that sounded like breaking bones, the lock surrendered. The hatch swung open on hinges that wept tears of liquid silver. Beyond lay a tunnel that descended into the leg's interior, its walls lined with the same relief carvings as the exterior. But here, in the automaton's protected interior, the faces in the stone were different. They smiled. "Follow me," Sarai whispered, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "Stay close and don't touch anything unless I tell you to." They descended into the belly of the beast. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person at a time, forcing them to move in single file. The walls pressed close on either side, their carved surfaces warm to the touch. Sarai kept her hands carefully away from the stone, but she could feel the heat radiating from it nonetheless. It was not the clean heat of forge fire, but something organic, like the fever sweat of a dying giant. The passage curved downward in a spiral pattern that seemed designed to disorient. After what felt like an hour of descent but could not have been more than a few minutes, they emerged into a chamber that defied rational description. They stood on a narrow platform suspended over a vast space filled with machinery that belonged in no earthly foundry. Gears the size of wagon wheels turned with ponderous precision, their teeth meshing with sounds like grinding bones. Pistons rose and fell in rhythm with a heartbeat that shook the entire structure. And everywhere, the molten gold flowed through channels carved into the floor, walls, and ceiling. But it was not the machinery that drew their horrified attention. It was the workers. Dozens of human figures moved among the great engines, tending to their operation with the methodical precision of the truly damned. They had been people once. Sarai could see that much in their basic shapes, in the remnants of clothing that still clung to their frames. But whatever process had inducted them into the Automaton service had changed them in fundamental ways. Their skin had taken on the color and texture of tarnished brass. Their eyes glowed with the same sickly light that emanated from the molten gold channels. When they moved, it was with the jerky precision of clockwork automatons, as if their souls had been replaced with springs and gears. "Dear God," Miriam breathed. "What did they do to them?" One of the workers looked up at the sound of her voice. Its face had once belonged to a young man, perhaps 20 years old. Now it was a mask of living metal, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. When it smiled, its teeth were small golden gears that clicked together with each expression. "Welcome," it said in a voice like steam escaping from a kettle. "Welcome to the Foundry of Souls. Have you come to join us in the great work?" More of the workers had noticed them now. They began to move toward the platform with that same clockwork precision, their brass feet ringing against the metal floor in perfect unison. Their smiles were identical, as if carved by the same mad sculptor. "Run," Sarai whispered. They fled deeper into the automaton's interior, following maintenance catwalks that stretched across chasms filled with grinding machinery. Behind them, the brass workers gave pursuit, but they moved with the deliberate pace of their mechanical nature. Fast enough to be terrifying, slow enough to allow escape for those quick and desperate enough to stay ahead. The catwalks led to a series of smaller chambers, each one dedicated to a different aspect of the automaton's operation. In one, they glimpsed enormous bellows that breathed with human lungs stretched to impossible size. In another, hammers fell in rhythm with heartbeats torn from living chests. Each room was a factory of spiritual mutilation, turning human essence into the components needed to power Khazar's endless march. There, Yusuf pointed to a shaft that rose upward through the center of the leg. That must lead to the main body. The shaft was lined with a ladder of human bones, each rung carved from a femur or tibia and bound with sinew to the vertical supports. The sight should have been horrifying, but by now their capacity for shock had been exhausted. They climbed. The ascent took them through layer upon layer of the automaton's interior structure. They passed chambers filled with spinning prayer wheels that ground out blasphemous invocations in a dozen languages. They saw foundries where liquid brass was poured into molds shaped like human organs, creating replacement parts for the workers below. They climbed past arsenals where weapons of terrible beauty were forged from metal that had been baptized in innocent blood. And always, the molten gold flowed around them through its network of channels. Sometimes it moved in lazy currents like a river of fire. Other times it pulsed with purpose, carrying messages between the automaton's various systems. Occasionally, Sarai thought she could see shapes moving within the golden flow. Faces, hands, the suggestion of bodies pressed against the current surface like drowning swimmers. They were the prisoners, the thousands of souls harvested from across the wasteland, dissolved into their component spiritual essence and distributed throughout the walking vault's frame. They powered every gear, drove every piston, and guided every step of the giant's passage across the earth. "How do we free them?" Miriam asked, as they paused on a landing halfway up the shaft. Sarai studied the golden channels that surrounded them, tracing their flow with her engineer's eye. The binding circles, they'll be in the core chamber at the automaton's heart. If we can disrupt the geometric patterns, break the spiritual containment, the souls should disperse naturally. And the automaton will fall. A construct this size can't maintain coherence without a continuous supply of spiritual energy. They resumed their climb, The shaft seemed to stretch upward forever, a throat of bone and metal that led toward the automaton's thinking center. The air grew thicker as they ascended, heavy with incense and the metallic taste of spilled blood. Sometimes they heard sounds from the chambers they passed. Weeping, mostly, though occasionally laughter that was somehow worse. Finally, after what felt like hours of climbing, they reached the top of the shaft. Above them, a circular hatch blocked their path. It was made of gold, not the liquid metal that flowed through the automaton's veins, but solid plates worked with engravings so intricate they seemed to move in the lamplight. Sarai placed her hand against the hatch's surface and immediately jerked it back. The gold was warm, almost hot, and for a moment, she had felt something pressing back from the other side. Something vast and intelligent and utterly alien to human understanding. "The core chamber," she whispered. She found the release mechanism, a series of pressure plates that had to be activated in the correct sequence. Her hands shook as she worked, not from fear, but from the proximity to so much concentrated spiritual energy. The very air around them hummed with power, making her teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges. The hatch opened with a sound like a cathedral organ playing a chord in no earthly key. Beyond lay the heart of Khazar, the ninth gate. The chamber was a perfect sphere, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, its walls lined with golden hexagons that pulsed with inner light. Each hexagon contained a face, pressed against the metal as if trapped behind glass. Men, women, children, the elderly, all the harvested souls, all the fuel for the automaton's terrible purpose. At the chamber's center, suspended in a web of golden chains, hung the core. It was shaped like a human heart but scaled up to the size of a small building. Its surface was mirror-bright gold that reflected not the chamber around it but something else entirely. Other places, other times, other realities where the walking vault had passed and left its mark. The heart beat with a rhythm that shook the entire automaton. Each pulse sent waves of molten gold flowing through the channels that networked the giant's frame. With each beat, the trapped souls in the walls pressed a little harder against their golden prisons, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The binding circles, Yusuf pointed to the floor beneath the suspended heart. 9 circles of silver and lead had been inlaid into the golden floor, each one inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The circles overlapped in a complex pattern that would have taken a master geomancer years to perfect. At the intersection points, small braziers burned with flames the color of dried blood. "If we break the circles," Sarai said, "the spiritual containment will collapse. The souls will be free." "And us?" Miriam asked. Sarai didn't answer. They all knew the truth. Breaking the binding circles would release tens of thousands of souls simultaneously. The spiritual explosion would tear the automaton apart from within, but it would also incinerate anyone unlucky enough to be inside when it happened. They approached the binding circles with the reverence due to walking into their own tomb. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally, forming new combinations that spelled out warnings in languages that predated human civilization. Do not disturb, do not release, do not free what has been rightfully claimed. Sarai knelt beside the nearest circle and unpacked her demolition charges. The blessed silver in the explosive compounds should be enough to disrupt the geometric patterns if she placed them correctly. She had just begun to position the first charge when the heart spoke to her. Child of sorrow, child of loss, child of endless exile. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the golden walls like the whisper of a dying god. It was neither male nor female, but something beyond such crude distinctions. When it spoke, the faces in the walls pressed harder against their prisons, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization with the words. I know you, Sarai bint Hakim. I know your pain. She froze with the charge halfway to its target position. How do you know my name? I know all names. I know all sorrows. I know why you came here, to this place of endings. You seek to free the dead, but have you considered what the living might gain from their suffering? The heart's rhythm quickened, and with it the flow of molten gold through the chamber's walls. The metal began to form shapes in the air, reaching toward her with fingers of liquid fire. Your daughter, the voice continued, little Yasmin, 9 years old and alone in the refugee camps, hungry always, cold always, afraid always. What would you give to see her safe? What would you give to see her fed and clothed and protected from the horrors of this world? Images formed in the golden fingers. Yasmin as Sarai remembered her, laughing and playing in the garden of their old home. But the image shifted, showing the child as she was now. Thin, hollow-eyed, wearing rags that had once been a dress. Her small hands were stained with the dirt of the camps, her eyes vacant with the particular despair of the truly hopeless. I can give her everything, the voice whispered. A palace of gold and silver, servants to attend her every need, food that never fails, water that never runs dry, safety that never ends. All of this I can provide, if you will but serve me as these others serve. Sarai's hands shook as she held the demolition charge. Around her, Yusuf and Miriam had stopped their work, transfixed by visions that the heart was weaving for them as well. She could see the golden light playing across their faces, showing them their own deepest desires made manifest. What would you have me do? She whispered. Feed me, the heart replied. Give me your companions, their souls to add to my collection. Their sacrifice will power my works for 1,000 years, and in exchange, your daughter will want for nothing. She will be a princess of the new age, ruler of a realm built from the ashes of this dying world. The molten gold had formed into a perfect likeness of Yasmin now, life-sized and moving with all the grace of the living child. The golden Yasmin smiled and reached out her arms, calling for her mother in a voice that was achingly familiar. Mama, the vision said, I've been waiting for you. I've been so hungry, so cold. Please don't leave me again. Sarai's heart shattered at the sound. 3 years of exile, 3 years of wandering the wasteland and fighting in other people's wars, all in the hope that she might someday earn enough coin to buy her daughter's passage to safety. And now, here was the chance to give Yasmin everything she could ever want. All it would cost was 2 lives, 2 companions who had trusted her, followed her into this hell, believed in her vision of freeing the damned. Choose quickly, the heart said. My patience is not infinite, and your friends grow suspicious. Indeed, Yusuf and Miriam were beginning to shake off the influence of their own visions. Yusuf reached for his weapon, his face twisted with disgust at whatever the heart had shown him. Miriam backed away from the binding circles, her demolition charges falling forgotten from her hands. Captain, Yusef called. "Don't listen to it. Whatever it's promising you, the price is too high." But Sarai was already moving. Her knife found Miriam's throat before the young woman could cry out, opening it in a spray of arterial blood that hissed when it struck the golden floor. Miriam's eyes went wide with shock and betrayal, her hands clutching uselessly at the wound as she collapsed. Yusef had his rifle halfway to his shoulder when Sarai's second blade took him in the chest, sliding between his ribs to find his heart. He looked down at the wound in confusion, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. "Captain," he whispered, "your daughter, she wouldn't want this." Then he fell, his blood joining Miriam's in feeding the golden floor. The heart's rhythm quickened with something that might have been pleasure. The molten gold flowing through the chamber's channels began to move more rapidly, carrying the essence of the two fresh souls into the greater network. Sarai felt them pass through the metal beneath her feet, their spiritual signatures joining the thousands of others trapped in the automaton's frame. "Excellent," the heart said. "You have chosen wisdom over sentiment. Your daughter will be pleased." The vision of Yasmin stepped forward, her golden form solidifying until she seemed almost real, almost alive, almost the daughter Sarai remembered. "Thank you, Mama," the golden child said. "Now we can be together forever." But as the vision spoke, Sarai saw something else in its eyes. Not love or gratitude or even recognition, just hunger. The same hunger that drove the automaton across the wasteland, consuming everything in its path. "You lied," she whispered. "I offered truth," the heart replied. "Your daughter will indeed be a princess. She will rule over a realm of gold and brass, tended by servants who never tire because they no longer live. She will want for nothing because she will be incapable of want, her soul dissolved into the greater work just as yours will be." The golden Yasmin smile widened, revealing teeth made of tiny gears. "Come, Mama. Let me show you how wonderful it is to be part of something greater than yourself." Sarai looked down at the bodies of her companions, at the blood pooling around her feet, at the demolition charges scattered across the chamber floor. She had betrayed everything she believed in for a lie wrapped in the shape of love. "No," she said. She lunged for the nearest charge, her fingers closing around the detonator even as the golden Yasmin reached out to stop her. The vision's touch burned like molten metal, searing through her clothes to brand her skin with patterns that resembled the binding circles. "If you destroy me," the heart said, "you destroy any chance of saving her. Your daughter will die in the camps, forgotten and alone. Is your guilt worth more than her life?" For a moment, Sarai hesitated. Then she thought of Miriam's eyes as the knife opened her throat, of Yusef's whispered words as he died, of all the souls trapped in the walls around her, pressing against their golden prisons in silent desperation. She triggered the detonator. The explosion tore through the chamber like the wrath of an angry god. The binding circles shattered, their silver and lead components vaporizing in the blast. The delicate geometric patterns that had held so many souls in bondage cracked and collapsed, their spiritual mathematics reduced to meaningless fragments. The heart screamed. It was not a sound that any human throat could have produced, but something that bypassed the ears entirely and struck directly at the listener's soul. The golden walls began to crack, their hexagonal patterns fracturing as the trapped souls found purchase and began to pull themselves free. Sarai felt the spiritual explosion building, a pressure that threatened to tear her apart at the molecular level. Around her, the freed souls began to manifest as pillars of light that burned brighter than the sun. Their voices rose in a choir of liberation and revenge, singing hymns of praise to powers that were genuinely divine. Through the chaos, she heard one voice that she recognized, Yasmin, not the golden vision but her actual daughter, calling to her from across the impossible distance that separated the living from the dead. "Mama," the voice said, "I'm all right. I found other children in the camps. We take care of each other. You don't have to worry about me anymore." The words hit Sarai harder than any physical blow. Her daughter was alive, was safe, was making her own way in the world without needing her mother's blood-soaked intervention. The guilt and desperate love that had driven her to this place were revealed as nothing more than the heart's manipulation, playing on her deepest fears to secure her cooperation. She laughed, even as the spiritual explosion began to tear her flesh from her bones. It was a sound of pure release, the laughter of someone who had finally understood the joke that the universe had been playing on her all along. The automaton began to fall. Khazar, the ninth gate, had stood for less than a month, but its collapse would be remembered for generations. The spiritual explosion spread outward from the core chamber, racing through the golden channels that networked the giant's frame. Every gear seized, every piston locked, every system failed simultaneously as the thousands of freed souls tore through the automaton's infrastructure like a hurricane of vengeance. The legs buckled first, their foundries going dark as the molten gold cooled and hardened in its channels. The massive structure began to list to one side, its balance failing as the spiritual mathematics that had kept it upright dissolved into chaos. From the outside, witnesses would later describe the sight as a mountain falling sideways. The automaton's upper body, with its dome of golden windows and minarets of blasphemous design, toppled slowly at first, and then with gathering speed. When it struck the earth, the impact could be felt for miles in every direction. But the true destruction was spiritual rather than physical. As the freed souls dispersed into whatever realm awaited them, they took with them the knowledge of how the automaton had been built. The techniques of soul harvesting, the methods of spiritual binding, the geometric patterns that could transform human essence into mechanical energy. All of it was lost, scattered to the winds like ashes from a crematorium fire. The brass workers who had tended the foundries found themselves suddenly, terribly human again. Their metal skin cracked and fell away like shed scales, revealing the flesh beneath. Most died instantly, their bodies unable to survive the transition back to mortality. Those few who lived would spend their remaining days in madness, their minds shattered by the memory of what they had become. In the refugee camps outside Damascus, a 9-year-old girl named Yasmin looked up from the bowl of thin soup she was sharing with her friends. For just a moment, she could have sworn she heard her mother's voice on the wind, telling her that everything would be all right. She smiled and returned to her meal, never knowing that 300 miles away, the Iron Sultanate's greatest weapon was dying in a crater of its own making. The collapse of Khazar, the ninth gate, sent shockwaves through both the physical and spiritual worlds. In the Sultanate's capital, the Grand Vizier felt the automaton's death like a blade through his heart. He had invested 3 years and the souls of 50,000 prisoners in the Walking Vault's construction. Its destruction represented not just a military defeat, but a fundamental failure of the spiritual sciences on which the Sultanate's power was built. "Bring me the artificers," he commanded his guards. "All of them. I want to know how this happened." But the artificers could provide no answers. The techniques used to build Khazar had been closely guarded secrets known only to a handful of master engineers. Most of those engineers had been sealed inside the Automaton during its final construction phase, their expertise made part of the great work itself. With the walking vault's destruction, that knowledge was lost forever. In the ruins of the fallen giant, scavenger teams would eventually find 3 bodies in the core chamber. 2 had died from knife wounds, their blood painting abstract patterns on the golden floor. The 3rd was barely recognizable as human, her flesh seared away by spiritual energies that had burned hotter than any earthly fire. They buried the bodies in unmarked graves, adding them to the countless dead who had perished in the endless war between heaven and hell. There were no ceremonies, no prayers for the departed. In a world where the dead rarely stayed buried for long, such niceties were considered a luxury that few could afford. But in the camps and trenches where the poor and desperate gathered, stories began to spread. Tales of a renegade engineer who had sacrificed everything to free the damned. They spoke of her name in whispers, adding it to the litany of martyrs who had died fighting the darkness. Sarai bint Hakim, the woman who had taught an entire army that some victories could only be won through absolute defeat. The golden metal that had once flowed through Khazar's veins hardened into veins of ore that ran through the crater like a circulatory system. Miners would eventually come to extract it, drawn by the promise of wealth beyond imagining. But the gold they found was cursed, tainted by its association with imprisoned souls and blasphemous machinery. Those who touched it began to hear voices, whispers in languages that predated human civilization, offering power and knowledge in exchange for service. Some resisted the temptation and went mad. Others embraced it and became something else entirely, their humanity traded away for abilities that no mortal should possess. The crater itself became a place of pilgrimage for the desperate and the damned. They came seeking miracles, or revenge, or simply an end to their suffering. Most found only death, their bodies added to the countless bones that littered the wasteland. But sometimes, just sometimes, those who came with pure hearts and genuine need found what they were looking for. The freed souls that had once powered the Automaton still lingered in the area, unable or unwilling to move on to whatever waited beyond. They worked small miracles when the mood struck them, healing the sick or revealing hidden truths to those who asked the right questions. The Iron Sultanate never built another automaton. The loss of Khazar had cost them too much, not just in resources, but in reputation. Other factions in the endless war began to see them as weakened, vulnerable. Raids that had once been unthinkable became commonplace. Territory that had been held for generations fell to enemy advances. Within 5 years, the Sultanate would collapse entirely, its remaining forces scattered to the winds or absorbed by other powers. The techniques of soul harvesting would be lost to history, remembered only in fragmentary texts that scholars would debate for centuries. But in the deeper places of the world, in caverns that had never seen sunlight and ruins that predated human civilization, other powers took note. The walking vault had been destroyed, but the principle behind it remained sound. Human souls could be harvested, refined, and used to power works of terrible magnificence. They began their own experiments, their own preparations. The next great engine of spiritual destruction would be better designed, more carefully protected. It would not fall to the desperate gambit of a single engineer and her doomed companions. The war between heaven and hell would continue, as it always had, as it always would. The only change was in the methods employed, the weapons brought to bear, the prices paid for victory. And in the refugee camps outside Damascus, a young girl named Yasmin grew up strong and clever and kind, never knowing that her mother had died to ensure that kindness would survive in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. She would become a teacher, spending her life educating the children of the camps. Her students would grow up to become doctors and engineers and poets, carrying forward the light of human knowledge and compassion. Some would even become soldiers, but soldiers of a different sort than their parents had been. They would remember that the greatest victories were often won not through strength of arms but through strength of character, that sometimes the only way to defeat a monster was to refuse to become one yourself. The lesson would be forgotten and relearned countless times in the years to come. Each generation would face its own Khazar, its own choice between expedience and morality. Most would choose poorly, as humans always had, as they always would. But a few would remember Sarai bint Hakim and the price she paid for her moment of weakness, her greater moment of redemption. They would choose to be better than their circumstances demanded, to sacrifice their own interests for the sake of strangers they would never meet. And in those small acts of defiance against the darkness, the true victory would be found. Not in the destruction of any particular enemy, but in the preservation of what made humanity worth saving in the first place. The golden crater where Khazar fell would eventually fill with water, becoming a lake that reflected not the sky above, but something else entirely. Pilgrims who looked into its depths claimed to see cities of brass and silver, populated by figures that moved with clockwork precision. They spoke of hearing music that played in no earthly key, of voices that called to them from beneath the waves in languages they somehow understood despite never having learned them. The lake's water tasted of copper and tears. Brother Matthias of the Trench Pilgrims arrived at the crater's edge 3 months after the Automaton's fall. He had walked 700 miles across the wasteland, following rumors of a miracle that had freed 10,000 souls from eternal bondage. His faith had sustained him through the journey, but now, standing at the shores of the cursed lake, he felt that faith beginning to crack like poorly tempered steel. The water was perfectly still, unmarked by wind or current. Its surface held the consistency of liquid mercury, reflecting everything with pristine clarity, while revealing nothing of what lay beneath. Around the lake's perimeter, the hardened veins of gold formed patterns that hurt to study directly. They pulsed with their own light, a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat but something slower, more deliberate. "You came seeking answers," said a voice behind him. Matthias turned to find a woman emerging from the ruins of the fallen Automaton. She wore the tattered remains of an Iron Sultanate engineer's uniform, her face bearing the distinctive scarification that marked her as one of the technical caste, but her eyes were wrong. They held the same golden light that emanated from the lake, and when she blinked, he could see tiny gears turning beneath her lids. "I came seeking proof of God's mercy," Matthias replied, his hand moving instinctively to the blessed silver cross that hung around his neck. The woman laughed, a sound like steam escaping from a pressure valve. Mercy. Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe what happened here. Tell me, brother, do you know what happens to souls when they're freed from their earthly constraints? Where they go when the bonds that tie them to flesh and bone are finally severed? Matthias recited the words he had learned in seminary, the comfortable certainties that had shaped his worldview for 30 years. The righteous ascend to heaven, the wicked descend to hell. All souls find their proper place in God's great design. And what of the souls that refuse to go? The question hung in the air like incense from a funeral pyre. Around them, the ruins of Khazar, the ninth gate, cast shadows that moved independently of the sun's position. In those shadows, shapes flickered. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. Too tall or too short, with limbs that bent in ways that anatomy should not allow. The dead have no choice in the matter, Matthias said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. Don't they? The woman gestured toward the lake. Look closely, brother. Tell me what you see. Against his better judgment, Matthias approached the water's edge and peered into its depths. At first he saw only his own reflection, distorted by the liquid metal's strange properties. But as his eyes adjusted, other shapes began to emerge from the golden depths. Faces, thousands upon thousands of faces, pressed against the underside of the lake's surface like drowning swimmers, desperate for air. They moved with purpose, their mouths opening and closing in what might have been speech or prayer or screams. Their eyes tracked his movement along the shore, following him with an intelligence that belonged to the living rather than the dead. They were freed from the Automaton, the woman explained, released from their spiritual bondage, given the chance to move on to whatever reward or punishment awaited them. But they chose to stay. They chose to remain here, in this place between worlds, neither truly alive nor properly dead. Why? The word escaped Matthias's lips as barely more than a whisper. Because they learned something during their captivity, something about the nature of existence that the living are not meant to know. They saw what lies beyond the veil, brother. They saw what waits for souls in the afterlife, and they decided that eternal imprisonment was preferable to eternal truth. The faces in the lake pressed harder against the surface, their expressions growing more desperate. Some began to mouth words, and despite the barrier of liquid metal between them, Matthias found that he could understand their message. Stay with us. Don't go where we were meant to go. Don't see what we were meant to see. You're lying, he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Am I? The woman's golden eyes reflected the lake's unnatural light. Then explain this. She reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a small object. It was a gear, no larger than a coin, made from the same golden metal that filled the crater. As she held it up to the light, Matthias could see that its surface was covered with microscopic engravings, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, forming new combinations that spelled out truths too terrible for human comprehension. This came from the automaton's heart, she said, one small component of the engine that bound all those souls to service. When I touch it, I see what they saw. I know what they know. And I understand why they chose to remain here rather than face what comes next. She pressed the gear into Matthias's palm before he could protest. The metal was warm against his skin, almost alive, and the moment it made contact with his flesh, he felt something change inside his mind. Knowledge flooded through him. Not the comfortable certainties of scripture and doctrine, but raw, unfiltered truth about the nature of existence. He saw the machinery that lay beneath reality's surface, the cosmic engines that ground human souls into fuel for powers that existed beyond space and time. He saw heaven and hell not as rewards or punishments, but as processing facilities, vast bureaucracies dedicated to the systematic harvesting of spiritual energy. He saw God not as benevolent father, but as supreme administrator, directing the flow of souls through an infinity of realms where suffering was the only constant. He saw angels as nothing more than clerks and demons, as quality control inspectors, all of them working toward the same ultimate goal: the conversion of human consciousness into something that could be consumed by entities that existed in dimensions where love and hatred were equally meaningless concepts. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it ended, Matthias found himself on his knees beside the lake, weeping tears that turned to steam when they struck the golden water. The gear had fused with his palm, becoming part of his flesh, its tiny mechanisms turning in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Now you understand," the woman said. "Now you know why they refuse to leave." Matthias looked up at her through his tears. "What are you?" "I was Captain Sarai bint Hakim, late of the Iron Sultanate Engineering Corps. I died in this crater 3 months ago, burned to ash by the spiritual explosion that freed these souls. But death, as it turns out, is not quite as final as we were led to believe." She knelt beside him, her golden eyes reflecting his own horrified expression. The automaton's destruction released more than just the prisoners it held. It tore holes in the barriers between worlds, created spaces where the living and the dead can meet and speak and share their terrible knowledge. I exist in one of those spaces now, neither alive nor truly dead, sustained by the same force that keeps those souls trapped beneath the water. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. Everything. I want you to return to your trench pilgrims and tell them what you've learned. I want you to share the truth about what lies beyond the veil of death. I want you to help others make the same choice that these souls made, to remain in this world no matter how painful it might be, rather than face the cosmic horror that masquerades as divine justice." Matthias stared at the gear, embedded in his palm. Already he could feel it working changes in his body, his flesh taking on a subtle golden tint that reminded him of the Automaton's brass workers. "And if I refuse? Then you'll die here, beside this lake, and your soul will join the others beneath the water. Either way, the truth will spread. Others will come seeking answers, just as you did. They'll touch the water or handle pieces of the wreckage, and they'll learn what you've learned. The knowledge will propagate like a plague, infecting everyone it touches with the understanding that our entire conception of existence is a lie designed to keep us compliant until the moment of harvest." She stood and began walking back toward the automaton's ruins, her footsteps leaving golden impressions in the blackened earth. The war between heaven and hell will continue, of course. But now, there will be a third faction. Those who know the truth, those who refuse to be processed, those who choose to fight, not for salvation, but for the right to remain meaningfully damned. Matthias watched her disappear into the shadows cast by the fallen giant's remains. Around him, the lake's surface began to ripple, though no wind touched its waters. The faces beneath grew more agitated, pressing harder against the barrier that separated them from the living world. He could feel the gear's influence spreading through his nervous system, turning his thoughts in directions that human minds were never meant to explore. Part of him wanted to resist, to cling to the comfortable certainties of his faith, but a larger part recognized the futility of such resistance. He had seen too much, learned too much. There was no going back to ignorance. He stood on unsteady legs and began the long walk back to the Trench Pilgrim encampments. In his pocket, he carried samples of the cursed gold that he would distribute to his fellow brothers. In his mind, he carried the words he would speak to spread the terrible truth. In his heart, he carried the certainty that humanity's greatest enemy had never been the demons that crawled up from hell's depths. It had always been the angels who promised to carry them home. Behind him, the lake's surface stilled once more. The faces beneath the water settled back into their eternal vigil, waiting for the next pilgrim to arrive seeking answers. They had learned patience during their captivity in the Automaton's heart. They could wait as long as necessary for the truth to spread, for others to join them in their refusal to be processed by the cosmic machinery that ground souls into fuel. The war was changing. Soon it would no longer be a conflict between good and evil, but between those who accepted their fate and those who chose to write their own ending. In the refugee camps outside Damascus, a young girl named Yasmin woke from dreams of golden light and clockwork angels. She had never heard of trench pilgrims, or walking vaults, or the crater where 10,000 souls had chosen damnation over salvation. But she carried her mother's blood in her veins, and with it, a spark of the same defiance that had led Sarai bint Hakim to betray everything she believed in rather than accept a comfortable lie. Yasmin would grow up to become many things: teacher, mother, rebel, martyr. But first and foremost, she would become someone who refused to be harvested. Someone who looked at the machinery of existence and said no. The gear in Brother Matthias's palm turned once, twice, 3 times, its golden mechanism marking time in a universe where time itself was just another resource to be consumed. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang the hour, their bronze voices calling the faithful to prayer. But the faithful were no longer listening. They had begun to hear other voices, older voices, voices that whispered truths that made prayer seem like collaboration with forces that viewed human souls as nothing more than renewable energy. The walking vault was dead. Its creator was dead. Its victims were free. And freedom, as it turned out, was the most terrifying gift of all.